English natural philosopher Francis Bacon was a key figure of the scientific revolution. Today, many academics and educated lay people still take it for granted that Bacon was one of the first modern scientists, or an early spokesman for Western scientific naturalism. But historical primary sources reveal that Bacon was in fact a strong believer in alleged occult phenomena. In his writings, Bacon even suggested experiments to put certain strange effects to the test, only to advise against this kind of research in the end. Stay tuned to find out why and to learn more about Bacon's views on magic in the context of his time. Welcome and thank you for joining me again. Last time we concluded our little series on the haunted past of modern science by looking at Nobel Prize winner in physics Wolfgang Pauli, who tried to make sense of his own claimed poltergeist-style experiences through Jungian psychology. And we saw that in a booklet published together with Carl Gustav Jung, Pauli used the history of science to suggest that he and Jung in fact continued a philosophical tradition that went back to the days of Johannes Kepler, who was, of course, one of the giants of the so-called scientific revolution. Now, in case you're wondering, professional historians have given an overall nod of approval to the accuracy of Pauli's translations and interpretations of his early modern primary sources. Still, the fact remains, of course, that Pauli consciously used the history of science to change or influence beliefs. And the considerable appeal of making historical claims for the very purpose of changing or influencing beliefs of the present is one of the key topics we will come back to more than once. And in this regard, it's worth repeating that at the time when Pauli presented his own interpretations of history, most fellow scientists and even many professional historians did subscribe to the view that key figures of the scientific revolution really belonged to the first generation of Western thinkers who systematically began to reject magic and occult principles. Legendary popularizer of science Carl Sagan, for example, also thought he had history on his side when he quoted the English natural philosopher Francis Bacon as an enemy of occult superstition and magic in his best-selling book The Demon-Haunted World. Sagan's overall portrayal of the scientific revolution as the supposed dawn of Western scientific naturalism had the obvious aim to suggest to his readers that Bacon and other key figures of the scientific revolution were more or less prototypes of 20th century scientists like Sagan himself, who no longer believed in magic because it was supposedly vanquished by science. We're going to work our way up in time to science popularization in the 20th century soon enough. And to make sure you won't miss that, remember to subscribe and click the bell icon to get notifications of new videos. As always, I compiled my sources and recommended readings for this video on a dedicated webpage. The link to the page and Amazon links to recommended books for today is in the description box. And here are two key readings which I specifically recommend for today's topic. For the current state of historical research on the scientific revolution, including of course the role of magic, there's no better introduction than The Scientific Revolution by Stephen Shapin at Harvard. Shapin is a leading historian of early modern science who wrote his book especially for non-historians. Make sure you get the second updated edition published in 2018, whose cover looks like this. The second title I recommend is also written for a broad audience, looking at the significance of magic in the work of Francis Bacon. This book was written by John Henry at Edinburgh University. And John Henry is another highly regarded historian of the scientific revolution. Was Bacon a scientist? Well, let me put it this way. If you could travel back in time and called Bacon a scientist to his face, his response may look a little like this. To begin with, calling Bacon a scientist would be a complete anachronism, not least because the very word scientist didn't even exist in Bacon's time. In fact, the term scientist was only coined in 1834 by the English polymath William Whewell at Cambridge University. And of course, thinking of a scientist, you probably have someone in mind who conducts experiments and publishes the results. However, Bacon conducted and published precious little experimental work. The actual significance of his writings mainly concerned the way he thought about the best methods of establishing knowledge about the natural world. So if there is an anachronism that may be a little bit more forgivable than calling Bacon a scientist, it would perhaps be calling him a philosopher of science. But then again, efforts of establishing knowledge about the natural world back in Bacon's days wasn't actually called science, but natural philosophy. And that's also why Bacon and others who were doing what we now roughly recognize as science called themselves natural philosophers. And when natural philosophers referred to the Latin words scientia or scientia, from which the English word science originates, they had the broadest possible body of knowledge in mind. This, of course, is quite different from modern sciences of our present, with their almost endless and highly specialized sub-branches. Perhaps most importantly, however, natural philosophy was still inseparable from theology and metaphysics. And that's, of course, highly relevant as we are looking at Bacon's beliefs in certain occult phenomena. Now, to be fair, Sagan and others did not simply make up the statements they quoted or paraphrased from Bacon's writings. Here is one such quote, which really seems to show Bacon as a critic of magical thinking. Identifying what he calls the general root of superstition, Bacon complains that men observe when things hit and not when they miss, and commit to memory the one and forget and pass over the other. What Bacon means here is what modern psychologists might call confirmation bias. And that's the tendency of our memory and perception to be selective in order to confirm our pre-existing beliefs. For example, let's assume I believe seeing a black cat means bad luck. Now, just before I have an accident, I happen to notice a black cat. In line with my previous belief that black cats are bad omens, I will assume a causal link between seeing the cat and having an accident. But the reason why I make this connection is because my prior belief biased me into failing to notice or to remember the dozens, if not hundreds of other times when I spotted a cat without anything bad happening. And it turns out that Sagan and others who used quotes like these to portray Bacon as a fellow skeptic of magic were not exactly immune to a different kind of confirmation bias themselves. Because it's actually quite difficult to miss all the other statements in Bacon's writings, which shine quite a different light on his attitude to magic. Let's begin with a quote even the most open-minded scientist, or historian for that matter, will find pretty hard to swallow. It is an usual observation that if the body of one murdered be brought before the murderer, the wounds will bleed afresh. Some do affirm that the dead body, upon the presence of the murderer, has opened the eyes, and that there have been such like motions as well, where the parties murdered have been strangled or drowned. But then, to be fair to Bacon, this belief actually did seem fairly widespread among natural philosophers at the time, as for example the now classical survey of magic in the history of experimental science by Lynn Thorndike has shown. Also, like several other natural philosophers of his time, Bacon believed in yet another highly strange reported phenomenon, and that was called the weapon salve. This refers to a healing practice in which the weapon that inflicted a wound was treated with ointment or a salve instead of the wound. Now, truth be told, I have no clue how any natural philosopher could seriously believe in the bleeding corpse thing. So if you happen to be a historian of early modern science who has looked into this, By all means, let us all know in a comment, okay? Regarding the weapon self, however, John Henry provides an interesting and plausible explanation of this belief, so that's another reason why you should check out his book. Now, highly paradox healing rituals like the weapon self squarely fell into a tradition which was called sympathetic magic, which Bacon evidently took very seriously. In fact, John Henry mentions that Bacon even started writing a whole book on the topic of sympathetic magic. And this finally brings us to an important inspiration for Bacon's natural philosophy, the natural magic of the Renaissance. Natural magic can be understood as the overarching framework of beliefs and practices in sympathetic magic. Some of the key authors of natural magic were Pico della Mirandola in Italy, Paracelsus in Germany and Switzerland, Jan Baptist van Helmont in the Netherlands, and Robert Flood in England, whose name we already came across last time. That's where we also briefly mention some basic assumptions of natural magic, such as the intrinsic interconnectedness of mind and matter, as well as the correspondence of all things and beings in the universe. Now, when you think of practices like the weapon self, which may seem rather absurd and even superstitious to us today, you may be surprised to hear that it was natural magicians like Mirandola and Paracelsus who were the first to take a broadly experimental approach to nature. And as John Henry and other historians of early modern science have shown, Francis Bacon consciously adopted and transformed the broad experimentalism of natural magic in his writings. One of the features Bacon seems to have adopted from the natural magic tradition was the distinction between supernatural miracles and natural but occult phenomena. For example, following his somewhat shocking confession of belief in corpses that responded to the presence of murderers, Bacon offers the following interpretation. It may be that this participates of a miracle by God's just judgment. But if it be natural, it must be referred to imagination. Bacon's reference to God's judgment in regard to miracles alludes to the notion that only God could produce properly supernatural phenomena or miracles, which constituted actual violations or suspensions of the laws of nature. But what does Bacon mean by imagination? This is another term that had quite a different meaning then compared to our use of it today. Because what Bacon means here is not that supposed witnesses just imagine things or fooled themselves. Because in the natural magic tradition the term imagination broadly referred to the influence of ideas or mental operations on matter. A related term was fascination, and that often simply meant a more pronounced form of imagination. In Bacon's own words, fascination was the power and act of imagination intensive upon other bodies than the body of the imaginant. So what Bacon meant by imagination as a cause for dead bodies ostensibly responding to the presence of a murderer was the natural but obscure mental influence either of a living person or some disembodied entity, perhaps the lingering spirit of the murder victim. Also in line with natural magic, Bacon believed that humans, spirits, and demons may well be able to produce phenomena that resembled divine miracles. But no matter how marvelous they appeared, these phenomena were preternatural at best. Exceptional and rare, yes, but violations of natural laws, no. Effects of magic were understood as natural phenomena which were produced according to the laws of nature that were understood by spirits and demons, but not yet by humans. And that's also why it wouldn't have made the slightest sense to Bacon and proponents of natural magic to call spirits and demons supernatural beings either. Here it's also worth remembering that the Latin occultus simply means hidden or secret, and was not yet conflated with the word supernatural as it is today. According to the rule book of natural magic, Bacon further distinguished between natural but occult phenomena that were worked by spirits from the outside, and the same marvelous but natural phenomena produced by the hidden capacities of living humans. Natural divination, or the knowledge of distant events or things to come, was one such phenomenon for him. For example, Bacon held that hidden powers of divination in humans could sometimes be observed when the mind, when it is withdrawn and collected into itself, hath some extent and latitude of pre-notion, which therefore appears most in sleep, in ecstasies and near death, and more rarely in waking apprehensions, and is induced and furthered by those abstinences and observances which make the mind most to consist in itself. In other words, Bacon here addresses alleged glimpses into the future, occurring during what we might call altered states of consciousness today, such as sleep, trance or ecstasy, meditation, and the process of dying. Now, many of the strange beliefs that were previously fairly widespread, such as in the efficacy of the weapon self, or claims of dead bodies bleeding in the presence of murderers, soon were a thing of the past. However, reports of the kind addressed in Bacon's last quote quite obviously did continue. And once we arrive in the 18th and 19th centuries, the immense significance of sleep, trance, and other altered states for the first properly experimental approaches to the unconscious mind, and of course its alleged occult capacities, will become obvious enough. And you don't want to miss that, do you? Returning to Bacon, the last quote concerning natural divination is from Of the Advancement and Proficiency of Learning. However, Bacon's most extensive treatment of supposed effects of natural magic is to be found in Silva Silvarum, which was published after Bacon's death. Alongside descriptions of various wonderfully bizarre things in which not many of us believe now, Silva Silvarum has lots of references to premonitions, mental healing, and other alleged phenomena which continue to cause rather heated debates today. Now, Bacon is still sometimes praised as the first major thinker to advocate a supposedly unrestricted empirical approach to nature. And as far as effects of natural magic are concerned, Bacon did state that they shouldn't be taken on belief alone, but that they could and should be tested empirically. He wrote, for example, "The relations touching the force of imagination require a great deal of examination before we can conclude upon them. I would have it first thoroughly inquired whether there be any secret passages of sympathy between persons of near blood, as parents, children, brothers, sisters, nurse-children, husbands, wives, etc. There be many reports in history that upon the death of persons of such nearness, men have had an inward feeling of it." Bacon then recounts a dream he had, which he thought may have anticipated his father's death in London, while Bacon himself was traveling France. We don't know if Bacon ever conducted any experiments to test effects of imagination or fascination, but he certainly did recommend a broadly experimental approach. For example, he wrote, "Some trial should be made whether pact or agreement do anything, as if two friends should agree that such a day in every week, they being in far distant places, should pray one for another, or should put on a ring or tablet one for another's sake. Whether if one of them should break their vow and promise, the other should have any feeling of it in absence." And there are several other formulations of more or less experimental investigations of occult phenomena in Bacon's writings. But how far was Bacon really willing to go in this regard? Now, questions regarding the nature of the soul have been hotly contested long before Bacon's time. And Bacon himself admitted that regarding the soul, natural philosophers had previously neglected to investigate whether it be native or adventive, and how far it is exempt from laws of matter, and of the immortality thereof, and many other points. Possible solutions have been not more laboriously inquired than variously reported, so as the travel therein taken seems to have been rather in a maze than in a way. So Bacon here almost seems to complain that the question of the nature of the soul has never been tackled in a really systematic manner. And the next quote implies that he did think it was possible, at least in principle, to scrutinize fundamental questions regarding the soul using empirical methods. But instead of formulating possible areas of research or even experiments, he actually nipped such scientific aspirations in the bud at the same time. But although I am of opinion that this knowledge may be more really and soundly inquired even in nature than it hath been, yet I hold that in the end it must be bounded by religion, or else it will be subject to deceit and delusion. The true knowledge of the nature and state of the soul must come by the same inspiration that gave the substance. To paraphrase, even though Bacon believed that souls and spirits were part of the natural order, Bacon here demands that knowledge about the hereafter of the soul must come not by natural, but by properly supernatural means. After all, in terms of natural magic, unlike natural divination, divine inspiration does fall outside the laws of nature. Well, so much for Bacon's supposedly unrestricted empiricism. And here it's also important to recall that Bacon was not just a natural philosopher. Serving as Lord Chancellor and General Solicitor of England, he was also quite a high-ranking statesman or politician. And here's an excerpt from his political writings concerning the legislation of magic and witchcraft. In his function as a statesman, Bacon demanded, for example, where a man conjures or invocates wicked spirits, it is felony. Where a man doth use or practice any manner of witchcraft whereby any person shall be killed, wasted or lamed in his body, it is felony. Where a man practices any witchcraft to discover treasure hid, or to discover stolen goods, or to provoke unlawful love, or to impair or hurt any man's cattle or goods, it is felony. So to wrap up and conclude, once we place Bacon's work back into the context of his own time, it's pretty clear that early modern understandings of science are almost literally worlds apart from those of modern science popularizers in the tradition of Carl Sagan and, of course, practicing scientists today. Next time we're going to look at developments just decades after Bacon's death, by returning to Robert Boyle and the early days of the Royal Society in London. By looking at Boyle's investigations of faith healing and clairvoyant visions, we will also raise the question in what sense religious priorities may have motivated as well as restricted his approach to ostensible occult phenomena. For now, remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the readings for today's video in the description box below. If you want to help me grow this channel and enjoyed today's episode, please like and share this video. Thank you so much for watching, and see you guys next time. And meanwhile,